The Duke of Thornbury set down his glass, and in the hush that followed, he told the drawing-room that he meant to choose his bride with a riddle. Clara Ainsley heard it from the window bay, where the Dowager had sent her to coax the guttering candles back to life. The wax had gone soft in the July heat and clung to her fingers like warm honey, and the whole long room smelled of it. Beeswax, hothouse roses, the faint powder rising off a dozen bare shoulders. She kept her eyes on the wick she was trimming. A maid who meant to keep her place learned to look at her work and hear everything. A riddle? Thornbury? A gentleman by the pianoforte laughed as though he expected to be told it was a jest. You cannot hang a duchess on a riddle. I mean precisely that. The Duke did not laugh. Gabriel Ravensworth was 27, broad through the shoulder, in a way his dark evening coat could not soften, and when he moved to the hearth the room seemed to rearrange itself around him. I have been paraded before every accomplished young lady in 3 counties this season. I have heard them play, I have heard them sing. I should like, once, to hear one of them think. At the head of the room the Dowager Duchess of Thornbury rapped her fan against the arm of her chair, a small dry sound, like a bird cracking a seed. You will make us the talk of the county. We are already the talk of the county, grandmother. Let us at least be interesting talk. He turned, and the candlelight ran gold along his jaw. Here is my proposal, and I will hold to it before every witness in this room. I shall put a single question to the ladies gathered under this roof. Any lady may answer, at any hour, once, she who gives me the true answer, not the clever answer, not the pretty answer, the true one, I shall court in earnest, and gladly. A rustle went through the silk, sharp as wind through barley. Near the fire, Lady Honoria Vane sat very straight. She was the loveliest woman in the room, and knew the precise value of it. Her father was the Earl of Carrow. Her gown was the deep red of a garden rose at dusk, and her smile had already begun, certain of its own arrival. Then pose it, Your Grace, Lady Honoria said. We are all attention. Gabriel looked once at the window. Clara felt it pass over her the way one feels a draught, and did not lift her head, and then he spoke. Faithful, I attend the crowned and the common alike. I stretch myself thin as the evening comes on, and shrink to nothing beneath the noon. I ask no wages and keep no secrets, for I can copy a man's every motion and never once speak his name. Tell me, what am I? The answer arrived in Clara's mind before he had finished, plain and complete, the way a struck bell arrives all at once. Her fingers stilled on the candle. She knew it the moment he said the evening comes on, because she had heard those very words in another voice, in a low room that smelled of tallow and ink, with a book open under a lamp and a man's patient hand turning the page. She knew the answer, and she knew the book it came from, and both pieces of knowing were dangerous to a housemaid who was meant to have neither. Conscience, pronounced a lady in blue, triumphant. No, said the Duke. Duty, offered another. No, a faithful servant, said Lady Honoria, and let the words settle prettily. Glancing about to be admired for it, something moved at the corner of the Duke's mouth. Nearer, he said, and yet no. He inclined his head to the room. You have until the party ends. One answer each. Good evening. He left them to their astonishment, and the astonishment broke into 40 voices at once. Clara pressed the softened wax flat with her thumb, took up her tray, and slipped out through the door the guests never used. And all the way down the cold service stair she carried the answer in her chest, like a live coal she must not let anyone see her holding. The kitchen passage was hot as a bread oven, and loud with the clatter of the great supper being cleared. Clara set her tray on the deal table and pressed the back of her wrist to her brow, where a curl had come loose and stuck damp against her skin. You've the look of a girl who's swallowed a secret, said Mrs. Doone, without turning from the range. The housekeeper was a wide, unhurried woman, with forearms like a laundress and eyes that missed nothing between the still room and the roof. Out with it, then, before it curdles you. His Grace has set the ladies a riddle. Clara reached for a cloth and began wiping the candle grease from her fingers, one by one. He says he'll court whichever of them answers it true. Mrs. Doone did turn at that. She looked at Clara over the steam a long moment. A riddle. To choose a wife. She shook her head and went back to her pot. That's a young man who's read too many books and danced with too many fools. Well, it'll keep the drawing room from dying of its own good manners. I'll say that. You don't think it's strange? I think everything the quality do is strange, and I've long since stopped waiting for it to stop. A ladle scraped. What was the riddle then? You've the ears for it. Clara hesitated. It would have been the simplest thing in the world to say it, to lay the whole neat answer out on the table between the copper pans and be, for one moment, the girl who knew. She felt the wanting of it go through her like thirst. I didn't catch all of it, she said. Something about a shadow of a thing. She was a practiced liar, in only this one respect. She had spent 4 years making herself smaller than she was. She had come to Thornbury under a plain surname that was not quite her own, with 2 references in a careful hand and no history worth the asking. Nobody at Thornbury knew that her father had been a schoolmaster in a Hampshire market town, a gentle, penniless scholar who had taught his daughter Latin at the kitchen table and set her riddles for the pleasure of watching her solve them. Nobody knew that when he was gone, the little school had gone with him, and the cottage, and the name that had once meant respectable, if never rich. Nobody knew that the girl who blacked the grates upstairs had read more books than any lady sleeping above her. That was the whole of Clara's safety, that no one knew. A maid who was cleverer than her betters did not keep her place. She was turned off with a character that mentioned insolence, and after that there was nothing at all. A shadow of a thing, Mrs. Doone repeated, amused. Well, whatever it is, it's no concern of ours. Take the small candlesticks up to the blue rooms. Lady Honoria's woman has been ringing this half hour, as though the house were afire. She paused, and her voice gentled by a fraction. And Clara, you've done a full day and half a night. Don't let them work the marrow out of you for a riddle you'll never hear the end of. No, Mrs. Doone. Clara took up the candlesticks. Their brass was cold and smooth against her hot palms. I never do. But she stood a moment longer than she needed to at the foot of the stair, in the tallow smell and the din, holding a knowledge she could tell no one, and it was not the drudgery that had worked the marrow out of her these 4 years. It was the silence. The riddle spread through the house like a fever, and for 3 summer days it broke on nothing. Clara watched it fail from the edges of every room, the way she watched everything. She carried a coal scuttle past the morning room, and heard a general's daughter propose reputation with great confidence, and be sent away disappointed. She turned down beds and found, tucked under a bolster, a page where some hopeful hand had written honor and time and memory in a wavering column, and struck each one out. She brought lemonade to the terrace in the white noon glare, and heard Lady Honoria hold court beneath a parasol the colour of cream, insisting to a knot of admirers that the Duke was toying with them all, that there was no answer, that a man who would not simply speak plainly of what he wanted did not deserve a plain answer in return. He wants a shadow of a thing, Clara thought, passing with her tray, and said nothing, and the wanting to say tightened another turn. On the 3rd evening the Dowager sent her to set the library to rights. It was the one room in the great house Clara loved without permission. It ran the whole depth of the south front, 2 stories of shelves with a gallery halfway up, and in the late light the leather spines glowed like the inside of a chestnut. It smelled of vellum and old smoke, and the green summer coming in at the open window, and the sound of her own feet on the boards was hushed by a carpet worn soft as moss. She had an hour, she supposed, before the gentlemen came in for their brandy. She meant to steal 10 minutes of it. She did not know the Duke was already there until she was well inside. He stood at the far window with his back to her and his coat off, in his shirt sleeves, one hand braced high on the frame. The evening had thrown his shadow long across the floor, thin and stretched toward her over the carpet, and Clara stopped with the answer to his own riddle, lying quiet at her feet in the shape of the man who had asked it. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." She dropped a curtsy he could not see. "I was told the room was empty. I'll come back." He turned. In the low gold light he looked younger than he had in the crowded drawing room, and more tired. Not the polished tiredness of a man who has danced too long, but the deeper kind, the kind that settles behind the eyes. "No, stay. I am poor company for myself tonight." He considered her without much curiosity, a servant among the furniture. "You are one of the house?" "Clara, if it please your grace." "Upstairs, maid." "Then set your room to rights, Clara, and pay no mind to me. I have been stared at over dinner for 3 days by ladies attempting to read the answer off my face." A dry note came into it. "I have begun to feel like a page that everyone reads and no one understands." She should have gone to the shelves and been silent. That was the whole of her craft, to be the thing in the room that does not answer. But he had said it so plainly, and so like a man alone, that the servant's mask slipped by the width of a breath. "Perhaps they are reading the wrong page, Your Grace," she said. He looked at her then. Properly, she felt the attention arrive, and knew, too late, that she had drawn it. Clara went quickly to the writing table and began gathering the scattered pens, keeping her back a little turned, her heart going hard and even under her plain grey bodice. "Fool," she told herself. 4 years of silence, and you spend it on a sentence. That is nearer the truth than anything I have heard in 3 days, the Duke said behind her, and I have heard a great deal. He came away from the window. She heard the boards give under him. Unhurried. "Sit down." "No, don't. I know you cannot." "Tell me then, since you are honest and my guests are not, why does no one answer my riddle?" "It is not my place to say, Your Grace. I release you from your place for the space of 1 question. Why?" Clara set the last pen straight in its tray. Through the open window a blackbird was pouring its whole heart into the blue evening, and somewhere below a scythe went whist through the long grass of the park, and the warm air moved the curtain against her arm. She thought of her father's hand on the page. She thought of a character that mentioned insolence. She weighed the one against the other, as she had weighed it 100 times a day for 4 years, and for once, perhaps because he had spoken like a lonely man and not a duke, the balance tipped. "Because they are all trying to be clever," she said, "and the answer is not clever. It is only true. They will not stoop to it, because it is beneath them. It is under their feet the whole while." The scythe stopped. The blackbird sang on. The Duke had gone very still. "Under their feet," he repeated. And Clara, who had guarded this for 3 days as though her life were folded inside it, who had carried it down the cold stair and into the hot kitchen, and swallowed it whole a dozen times, heard herself, at last, say it aloud, quietly, into the golden hush of the room, the way a person sets down a weight they can no longer hold. "A shadow, Your Grace. The answer to your riddle is a shadow." For a moment the whole room seemed to hold its breath with her, the long spines glowing, the curtain lifting. His own shadow lying stretched between them on the worn carpet, like a thing that had been waiting to be named. Then the Duke let out a breath, half a laugh and wholly astonished, and something crossed his face that she would not until much later understand. "Say it again," he said. "A shadow." Her voice was barely above the blackbird. "It attends the crowned and the common. It stretches thin as evening and shrinks at noon. It copies every motion and never speaks a name." She made herself stop. She made herself add, "Lo, I ought not to have spoken, Your Grace. Forgive me. I'll go." "You will not go." He crossed the space between them, and now there was nothing tired in his face at all. It was lit, wholly awake, and fixed on her as though she had walked out of one of the books behind her. 3 days. 14 ladies bred from the cradle to shine in exactly this way, and not one of them came within a mile of it. "And you?" He stopped, She watched him truly see her for the first time. The coarse grey stuff of her gown, the reddened knuckles, the loosened curl stuck to her damp temple, and behind all of it the thing she had spent 4 years hiding, now standing in her plain face with nowhere left to go. "Where," he said slowly, "does an upstairs maid learn the answer to a riddle that has defeated the flower of 3 counties? Anyone might guess it, Your Grace." No, the single word was gentle and absolutely certain. "No, they might not. You did not guess it. You knew it, and you knew it whole, the phrasing and all, as though you had met it before." He tilted his head, and his voice dropped, quick and low, the voice of a man following a scent. "You have met it before, haven't you? That is not a riddle of my own making, Clara. It is a very old one. It comes out of a book I have not seen since I was a boy, a little green book of enigmas he caught himself. A book scarcely a soul in England still owns. And yet you know it by heart." The blood went out of Clara's face and left it cold in all that warmth. Because she did know the book. She knew the very green of its cover, and the worn gilt of its spine, and the name printed small on the title page, and whose careful thumb had turned to the page where that riddle sat. She knew far more than she could ever let this man learn, and she saw, in the space of a heartbeat, exactly how much she had just given away. "I couldn't say, Your Grace." She dropped her eyes and reached for the last of her composure. "Only a servant's memory. I hear a deal of things, and hold on to the odd one. If Your Grace will permit, I'm wanted upstairs." "Clara," he did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I gave my word before every soul in that drawing room. I said I would court in earnest whoever gave me the true answer." A wondering, half-appalled amusement moved under the words. "I did not think to say a lady. I only said whoever." The room went perfectly quiet. "Your Grace cannot mean," she began, and could not finish it, because the impossibility was too large to fit inside a maid's mouth. "I hardly know what I mean." He raked a hand through his dark hair, and for one moment he looked exactly his age, a young man who had built a clever trap and caught in it the one creature he had never imagined. "But I have given my word, and I do not break my word, and you have answered my riddle when duchesses could not, and I find I very much want to know who you are before I decide what that obliges me to do." It was then that the library door, which Clara had left ajar behind her, swung wider on its silent hinge. She turned. In the doorway, framed against the bright candles of the corridor with her cream parasol still hooked over one wrist, and her rose-red gown the colour of a wound in that soft light, stood Lady Honoria Vane. She had come, no doubt, to try her own answer on the Duke in private. She had heard, instead, a housemaid give it. For one long breath, no one moved. Then, Lady Honoria's beautiful mouth curved, slow and certain, into a smile, and Clara understood, with the cold completeness of the answer itself, that whatever she had guarded for 4 careful years was no longer hers to keep. Lady Honoria did not hurry. That was the first thing Clara understood about her danger, that a woman so certain of her ground never needed to. She stepped over the threshold, as though the library had been arranged for her arrival, the cream parasol swinging gently at her wrist, and the candles of the corridor threw her rose-red shadow ahead of her, across the carpet, longer even than the Duke's. "Forgive me, Your Grace." Her voice was warm as syllabub, and just as thick. The door was open. "I came to give you my answer. I had it at last, over supper, but I see the field is already won." She turned her lovely eyes on Clara, and they moved down the grey stuff of her gown to the reddened knuckles, and back again, slow, appraising. The way one prices a horse one does not mean to buy. "By your maid." Lady Honoria. Gabriel had put a careful distance into his voice, the polished distance of the drawing room. "You will oblige me by keeping what you have heard to yourself." "Will I?" She laughed, low and delighted, drawing the parasol's ribbon through her fingers. "But Your Grace, it is the most wonderful thing I have heard all summer. You gave your word before 40 witnesses, I was one of them, that you would court whoever answered true. And here she is. The smile widened by a degree, and there was nothing soft in it now, only appetite. Are you a woman of parts, then? What are you called? Clara, my lady. She dropped the curtsy low and held it, eyes on the moss-worn carpet, on the toes of the lady's white kid slippers, unmarked by any flaw they had ever crossed. Clara what? The pens were still in Clara's hand. She felt the cold brass of them against her palm, and made her voice as small and dull as 4 years had taught her to make it. Ainsley, my lady. Only Ainsley. Only Ainsley. Lady Honoria repeated it as though tasting a dish she suspected of being off. And where did only Ainsley learn her letters, I wonder, that she should answer a riddle out of a gentleman's book when the Earl of Carrow's daughter could not? She tilted her head. The candlelight slid down the smooth column of her throat. It is very strange, Your Grace, is it not? A housemaid who thinks. One does like to know how a thing was managed. Servants who are cleverer than they ought to be have generally something behind them they would rather not show. The word behind went through Clara like a needle drawn through cloth. She kept her face flat, her breath even, but the heat of the room seemed suddenly to press against her, the beeswax and the summer green, and the faint rose that came off the lady herself, and under it all the cold small certainty that this woman had found the seam in her, and meant to pull it. She answered a riddle, Gabriel said. That is the whole of what has occurred. There is nothing behind it, but a good ear and a better wit. Then you will not mind my mentioning it. Lady Honoria was already turning, the parasol swinging, her train whispering across the boards. Such a droll story. The Duke of Thornbury, who would not have a duchess he could not respect, betrothed to the girl who lights his candles. She paused at the door and looked back, and her smile was a lovely thing, and pitiless. The county will be enchanted. I shall be so careful how I tell it. She was gone. The corridor light narrowed to a bar, and then to nothing as the door swung to behind her, and the library held only the two of them, and the blackbird which had stopped, and the scythe which had stopped, and the whole warm evening gone abruptly still. Clara set the pens down in their tray before her hand could betray her by shaking. Your Grace must let me go now, she said quietly. I have done you a great deal of harm in a very little time. If I am gone from your notice, if you say it was a servant's trick, a thing she overheard, it may yet come to nothing. Come to nothing. Gabriel stood where Lady Honoria had left him, and the light was going grey-gold at the windows, and he looked at Clara as though she had proposed to put out the sun for tidiness. You have just done what 14 women could not, and you wish me to pretend it was a trick. I wish to keep my place, Your Grace. It came out of her sharper than she meant, 4 years of swallowed things breaking the surface at once. She caught it back. Forgive me. But a lady like that does not tell a story to enchant the county. She tells it to break something. And there is nothing here to break. But me. She curtsied, and this time he did not stop her, and she went out through the door the guests never used, with the answer to his riddle finally, fatally, spoken aloud behind her, and the sense, sharp as the first drop of a coming storm, that she had traded 4 years of silence for a single quarter of an hour, and would be a long time paying the reckoning. The kitchen at that hour was cooling from its long day's fire, the great range ticking as it settled, and the smell of the cleared supper, mutton fat, scoured copper, the sweetish rot of vegetable parings in the pail, hung heavy in the low room. Clara came down the last of the cold stair into the warmth of it, and found Mrs. Doone at the deal table with her sleeves still pushed to the elbow, counting spoons back into their bays. There you are. The housekeeper did not look up. Lady Honoria's woman has rung 4 times, and I've sent Bess twice, and the 5th time I shall go up myself, and— She stopped. She had glanced at Clara's face, and whatever she saw there made her set down the spoon she held with great care, as though it had turned to glass. Sit down, girl. I can't, Mrs. Doone. There's the blue room still, and— "Sit down." It was not unkind. It was the voice she used when a scullery maid had scalded her wrist, low and level, and brooking nothing. Clara sat on the edge of the settle by the range, and the warmth of the dying fire came against her back, and she found she was cold all through in spite of the July night pressing at the window. "Now, Mrs." Doone lowered herself onto the bench opposite, her broad forearms flat on the scrubbed wood. "You went up to set the library straight, and you've come down looking as though you'd met your own grandmother's ghost." What's happened? For 4 years, Clara had told this good woman nothing that was true about herself, and had been grateful past speaking that she had never been asked. She looked now at the plain, honest face across the table, the eyes that missed nothing between the still room and the roof, and she understood that a half-lie would not serve her here, and that the whole truth would serve her worse. His Grace was in the library. Her fingers found a splinter of candle grease still caught in the weave of her cuff, and worked at it. "I ought to have gone straight out. I stayed. I spoke to him." Out of turn, the grease came free under her nail. The riddle, Mrs. Doone, the one he set the ladies. I knew the answer. And I said it. Mrs. Doone was quiet a moment. Somewhere above them a bell jangled on its wire, thin and cross, Lady Honoria's woman, ringing a 5th time, and neither of them so much as turned toward it. "You knew it," the housekeeper said at last, slowly, when 14 fine ladies bred up to nothing else could not. "Yes, and you said it." To his face. A long breath went out of her. "Clara Ainsley, in 4 years I've never once had cause to think you a fool, and I'll not begin tonight, so you'll tell me plainly, how does a housemaid come to have an answer that's beaten the whole drawing-room?" Here was the seam Lady Honoria had found. Here it was again, held out to her by the one person in the house she could not bear to lie to. Clara looked at the fire. "My father set me riddles," she said. It was true, and it was the smallest true thing she could give. "When I was a girl, he liked to see me puzzle them out. That one, I'd heard that one before, long ago, out of a book. It only came back to me. That's all." It was not all, and Mrs. Doone knew it was not all. Clara saw the knowledge move behind her eyes, and saw her, with a kindness that made Clara's throat ache, decide not to press it. "Your father," the housekeeper said. "A man who set his girl riddles out of books." She reached across the table and, briefly, laid her broad, warm hand over Clara's cold one, and just as quickly took it back, as though embarrassed by it. "Well, it's done, and there's no one saying a thing once it's been let out into the air. The question is, who else has the hearing of it?" Lady Honoria. Clara's voice was very low. She was in the doorway. She heard the whole of it. Mrs. Doone shut her eyes. When she opened them, she looked 10 years older in the ebbing firelight, and she rose from the bench with the heaviness of a woman taking up a burden she had carried before, and knew the weight of. "That one," she said. "That one would set fire to the hayrick for the pleasure of watching a body run for water." She took up her candle. "Go to the blue rooms, girl, before her woman rings the bell clean off its wire. Say nothing to nobody. And Clara," she paused at the foot of the stair, the small flame lighting her from beneath. "Whatever's behind you that you've never told me, keep it behind you a while yet. There's a wind getting up in this house tonight, and it's the tall trees it takes first, but it's the small ones it strips." Clara answered the bell. She dressed Lady Honoria's woman's complaints in the silence she had made her armor, and carried up the small candlesticks she had never delivered, and turned down the beds in the blue rooms with the counterpanes smelling of the lavender the laundry maids laid in the presses, and all the while the wind Mrs. Doone had named was rising, and she could feel it. She heard it in the way the housemaid's talk stopped when she came into the sewing room, and started again, altered, when she left. She heard it in the footman Thomas, who had always had a grin for her on the back stair, and now looked at her sidelong, as at a thing that had changed value overnight, and he could not yet say whether up or down. By morning the whole of below stairs knew that the quiet upstairs maid had answered the Duke's riddle, and half of them had it that she had done it to catch him, and the other half that he had gone soft in the head with the heat, and every one of them watched her over the porridge with the frank, unblinking interest of people to whom very little ever happens. And a little before noon, when the sun stood white and pitiless over the parched lawns, and the roses on the terrace hung their heads in the heat, Mrs. Doone came to find her at the linen press, with her face carefully closed. "The Dowager wants you," she said, in the small parlour. "Now, and tidy." The small parlour was the coolest room in the house at that hour, its blinds half drawn against the glare, so that the light came in gold, barred and dim, and it smelled of dried lavender and old rose leaves, and the particular dry, clean scent of a very old woman who has outlived every fashion but her own. The Dowager Duchess of Thornbury sat in a straight-backed chair by the empty grate with her fan closed in her lap, and her small bright eyes fixed on the door. And she watched Clara cross the carpet and sink into her curtsy with the unhurried attention of a magistrate. So, the fan tapped once against her knuckles, that small dry sound, a bird cracking a seed. "You are the maid. Clara, if it please your grace." "It does not particularly please me, but it is your name, and we must all bear something." The old lady studied her. "Stand up. Let me see the creature that has turned my drawing-room upside down and made my grandson the talk of 4 counties instead of 3. Clara rose. The Dowager's gaze went over her, slower even than Lady Honoria's had, and far harder to read. "You do not look clever. That is well. Clever-looking servants are insufferable. But my grandson tells me you answered his foolish riddle-hole, the very words of it, and he is not a man who imagines things. Where did you have it?" "I had heard the riddle before, your grace. Long ago. It only came back to me." "Heard it where?" "In a book, ma'am." Clara kept her eyes level with the Dowager's folded hands. "When I was a girl. My father was fond of such things." "Your father?" The Dowager's fan stilled. "And who was your father, that he owned such books?" Here was the seam again, and again, and Clara understood that in this house she would be asked it now by every soul who mattered, until she either lied so well it held, or told a truth that finished her. "A poor man, your grace," she said. "He kept a small school. It is all long done with." The old eyes did not blink. For a long moment the Dowager looked at her, and Clara had the uncomfortable sense of being read by someone a great deal cleverer than she looked. Someone who had sat 60 years in drawing-rooms watching people arrange their faces, and knew every arrangement there was. "A small school," the Dowager said at last, without inflection. "And now you black the grates. The world is a great engine for grinding people small, and it does its work very thoroughly." She unfolded the fan with a snap. "Understand me, girl. I do not care a straw whether you answered the riddle or the Sphinx herself set it for you. I care that my grandson has given his word before witnesses, and a Ravensworth who breaks his word is a thing I will not have while I breathe. He said he would court whoever answered true. He did not think a maid would do it. Nor did I, nor did anyone with sense. But there it is. And now there is Lady Honoria going about the house this morning, with a face like a cat at a dairy door, ready to make a scandal of it that will follow this family to its grave." The fan snapped shut. "You have put us all in a very awkward case, Clara Ainsley." "I know it, your grace." Clara's voice was barely steady. "I never sought it. If your grace wishes me gone from the house by this evening, I will go, and never say a word of it anywhere. I swear it, gone." The Dowager made a short, dry sound that in a younger woman might have been a laugh. "And have the county say the Duke of Thornbury turned off a girl in the night to hush a broken promise? You have no notion, child, how a great house is undone. Not by cannon, by whispers." She looked at Clara with something that was not warmth and was not quite its opposite. "No, you will not go. You will stay exactly where you are, and do your work, and hold your tongue, while I decide what is to be made of this ruin you have handed me. Now get out, and send me my grandson." Clara found the Duke, because a house tells its servants where its master is, even when it tells them nothing else, on the long terrace under the white noon, where he had walked out from the shade of the house into the full glare of the sun, as though he could not feel it. He stood at the balustrade with his coat off again. He seemed a man forever shedding the trappings of his rank the moment no lady was by, looking out over the parched park, where the heat stood in shimmering sheets above the grass. She came out into the light, with the dowager's summons in her mouth, and stopped a respectful distance off, and the sun struck the back of her neck like a warm hand. "Your Grace, the Dowager Duchess asks that you attend her in the small parlour." He turned, and it was strange and dangerous how the sight of him in the plain daylight, in his shirt-sleeves with his dark hair disordered by the hot wind off the lawns, undid something in her that the candle-lit library had only loosened. He was not looking at her as a duke looks at a servant. He was looking at her as though she were the most interesting problem he had been set in years, and he could not decide whether to be glad or afraid of it. "She means to scold me," he said. "I know the summons of old. When I was a boy, I could gauge the severity of the coming lecture by how many rooms she made me cross to receive it. The small parlour is her heaviest artillery." A rueful line came into his mouth. "She once kept me standing there a full quarter-hour over a broken window before she said a word. I confessed to 2 things I had not even done, only to end the silence. It surprised a sound out of Clara before she could stop it. Not quite a laugh, but its near neighbour, warm and startled, escaping into the hot bright air. She caught it back at once, her hand half rising to her lips, appalled at herself. A maid did not laugh at a duke's boyhood. A maid did not laugh at all where she could be seen. But he had seen. Something eased in his face at the sound. Some tightness she had not known was there until it went, and he looked at her with a sudden open pleasure that was worse for her, far worse, than all Lady Honoria's malice. "There," he said quietly. "You can do that. I had begun to wonder. I beg your pardon, Your Grace." She fixed her eyes on the flags of the terrace, hot through her thin soles. "I forget myself. It is the everyone is very strange with me today. I forget how to stand." "You need not stand any particular way with me." He came a step nearer along the balustrade and dropped his voice, though there was no one on all the shimmering terrace to hear. "Clara, I have not slept, thinking of it. Not the riddle. You, the whole impossible fact of you. A girl who blacks my grates and carries in her head a book that has been out of the world for 20 years. He shook his head slowly. "I know that book. Do you understand me? I know the very copy you had it from, I would swear I do. The little green enigma book, gilt worn off the top of the spine. A coffee ring on the flyleaf where some careless soul set down a cup. There cannot be 2 such in England. It was my mother's." The park swam for a moment in the heat, or Clara's sight did. She kept her face down. She kept it still, but her heart had gone to a slow, hard knocking that she was sure he must hear across the space between them, because it was not possible, it was not to be borne, that he should have named the very book, the worn green cover, the ghost of a coffee ring on the flyleaf. The book that at this moment lay wrapped in a length of flannel at the bottom of her own small box, under the eaves, 3 floors above his head. "I couldn't say, Your Grace." The words came out of her from very far away. "There are a great many books in the world. Not that one." He was watching her too closely, following the scent again, the way he had in the library, and she felt the net draw in. "My mother had it as a girl. She set me its riddles by the nursery fire. That one. The Shadow was the first I ever solved, and she gave me a sugared almond for it and told me I was cleverer than my father, which I was not to repeat." The rueful warmth flickered and went out. "When we lost her, the book went out of the house. My father could not have it by. It was sold, or given, or I never knew. I was too young to be told, and by the time I was old enough to ask, no one could say where it had gone." He looked at her, and his voice went very soft and very sure. "And now a maid in my own house has it by heart. You will not tell me that is chance." Clara lifted her eyes to him at last, because there was nothing else left to do, and she gave him the only thing she safely could, which was a truth shaped exactly like a lie. I never knew whose it was. Your Grace. That much was true. Her father had never said, and she had never thought to ask, and the small name printed on the title page had meant nothing to a schoolmaster's daughter in a Hampshire market town. It was only a book in my father's keeping, among a great many others. He was a collector of odd volumes. True, I could not tell you how it came to him, and that, God forgive her, was the lie entire, because she could tell him, or she feared she could, because the more she thought on it, standing in the white glare with her whole guarded life sliding out from under her, she knew all too well how a schoolmaster too poor to keep his own cottage had come by a duchess's book, and knew how the bare fact of it would sound spoken aloud. And it was a thing she would sooner have carried to her own grave than laid, half-told and open to every cruel reading, at the feet of the man who owned it. Then we shall find out together, Gabriel said, and there was something almost gentle in it, and something relentless underneath, and both of them frightened her equally. I have given my word to court whoever answered true. My grandmother is in a fury, and Lady Honoria is sharpening a scandal, and I have not the least idea in the world what is to become of any of it, but I will tell you what I told her, Clara. I do not break my word. And I find I do not want to. Behind them, at the tall glass door, onto the terrace, a footman had appeared. Thomas, his young face carefully wooden, with the particular stillness of a servant who has been standing longer than he wishes and has heard more than he ought. And beyond him, half in the cool shadow of the house and half out of it, her cream parasol raised now against the noon though there was shade in plenty, stood Lady Honoria Vane, watching the Duke lean close over the balustrade to speak with a housemaid, and Clara saw her mark it, and store it, and smile. Your Grace's grandmother is waiting, Clara said, and curtsied and fled, down off the burning terrace, and in through the servants' door into the blessed dimness, her ears full of the drone of the heat, drugged bees in the terrace roses, and her chest full of the certainty that whatever came now would come quickly, and that she had told, in the space of a single day, one truth too many, and one lie too dangerous to ever safely take back. She did not go straight to her work. She could not. She went up the 3 flights of the back stair, past the sewing room where the talk stopped when her shadow crossed the door, up under the hot slates where the maids slept two to a room, and the July sun had turned the little chamber into an oven, and she knelt on the bare boards by her narrow bed and drew out her box. It was a plain deal box, no bigger than a hat case, and it held the whole of what she had of her old life, 2 references in a careful hand that was not the hand of anyone who had ever known her. Her mother's thin wedding ring, too worn to sell, a lock of grey hair folded in paper, and at the bottom, under her one good Sunday shift, wrapped in a length of flannel to keep the damp from it, the book. She unwound the flannel with hands that were not quite steady, and there it was in the barred light through the little window, the worn green cover, the gilt gone from the top of the spine, the faint brown ghost of a coffee ring on the flyleaf where some careless soul, long ago, in another house, had set down a cup. She had known it all her life. She had thought it her father's, only her father's, one odd volume among his shelves of odd volumes. She turned to the title page, where the name was printed small, and above the printed name, in ink gone the colour of weak tea with the years, there was written in a fine sloping girl's hand a single line she had read 100 times and never once understood, for my Gabriel, that he may always be cleverer than his father, and never tell him so. Clara knelt on the burning boards with the book open in her lap and the whole of her 4 years' safety lying in ruins around her, and understood, at last and entirely, that the answer she had spoken in the library was the very smallest of the secrets this book was going to make her tell. Below, faint through 3 floors of the sleeping summer house, a bell began to ring, the front door bell, deep and unhurried, and a carriage she had not heard arrive stood steaming on the gravel in the noon heat, and a voice she did not yet know was giving a name to the footman at the door that would, before the day was out, cut the last ground from under her feet. The bell did not ring twice. Whoever stood on the gravel below was a person accustomed to being answered at the first summons, and Clara knelt a moment longer over the open box, the green book heavy as a stone in her lap, listening to the house wake beneath her. A door. A hurrying step on the stone. The long groan of the great front door, drawn back on its summer-swollen hinge. Then a voice came up through 3 floors of hot, still air, courteous and unhurried, and entirely strange to her, giving a name to the footman she could not catch, and she wound the flannel back around the book with fingers gone clumsy, and thrust it deep beneath her Sunday shift, and shut the lid. She went down. The back stairs were dim and close, the whitewash sweating in the heat, and she met Bess coming up 2 at a time with her cap askew. "There's a gentleman come," Bess said, breathless, delighted, for below stairs a new face at such a moment was better than a play. Grand old sort, and a valise of books, if you please, not a stitch of proper luggage. And Mr. Hartley's put him in the green chamber, and the dowagers had him straight into the small parlour before he'd got the dust off him. She caught Clara's sleeve. "They say he knew the old Duchess. Her that's gone. Who is he?" "Sir Summit." "Marchmont," Bess wrinkled her nose. "Sir Hugh Marchmont. Come for the party, only late, on account of the roads." "Why'd you look so, Clara?" "He's nothing to us." "Nothing," Clara said. "You're right, nothing to us." And she went on down into the kitchen passage with the name turning over in her, meaning nothing, and yet ringing some far-cracked bell at the very back of her memory that she could not for her life make sound clearly. Mrs. Doone stood at the foot of the stair with her arms folded and her face shut like a cupboard. She did not ask Clara where she had been. She took her by the wrist instead, drew her into the cool of the still room among the drying bunches and the brown crocks, and pushed the door to with her heel. "Now you listen to me," the housekeeper said, low and fast. "There's a gentleman above who knew this family when the old Duchess was living, and he's a great one for books and old papers. And her ladyship, Lady Honoria, was down here not 10 minutes since, in my kitchen, sweet as barley water, asking Bess a deal of questions about you." Her grip tightened. "About where you came from, whether you'd any people, whether you'd a box, and what was in it." The still room smelled of dried lavender and vinegar, and the green bitterness of tansy hung to keep the moth off, and under it all Clara felt the cold come up through the flags into her thin soles. "What did Bess tell her?" "Bess knows nothing. God be thanked, for you've told nothing, which is the one wise thing you've done in this whole sorry business." Mrs. Doone let her go, but that woman does not ask a question she hasn't already half the answer to. She's hunting. Clara, I've seen the like before. A lady with nothing to do and a spite to feed, and a servant for the fox. What's in your box, girl? For 4 years Clara had kept the still, honest face she kept now. But her heart was knocking, and Mrs. Doone had known her 4 years, and something must have shown, because the older woman's own face changed, went from fear for her to a deeper fear, the fear of a person who has just felt the ground move. "Nothing that's not my own," Clara said. It was true. It was the truest lie she had ever told. "Then keep it locked," said Mrs. Doone, "and keep the key on your own body. And don't you go up to that room again today for anybody's ringing, do you hear me? I'll answer the bells myself." She turned to the crocks, as though the matter were closed, and then, without looking round, in a voice gone suddenly rough, "You're the nearest thing to a daughter this old house has given me, and I've asked you nothing in 4 years. I'll not begin now, but I'm afraid for you. There, I've said it, and I'll not say it again." Clara stood in the vinegar and lavender dark, and could not answer her, because her throat had closed, and because through the still room's small barred window she had just seen, crossing the sunlit yard toward the kitchen door, with her cream parasol furled and her rose-red skirts caught up out of the dust, Lady Honoria Vane, coming down herself to the servants' floor a second time, which no lady in that house had done in living memory. She did not come into the kitchen. She sent Thomas. The footman found Clara in the scullery passage, with her arms full of the small candlesticks she still had not delivered, and he would not meet her eye. He had a paper folded small in his gloved hand, and he held it out to her the way a man holds out something he would rather not touch. "Her ladyship says you're to read it and give me your answer," Thomas said. His young face was miserable. "I'm sorry, Clara. There's things a man can't refuse in service. She spoke to Mr. Hartley. She'd have my place." He swallowed. "I'm right sorry. What have you done, Thomas?" He would not say. He pushed the paper into her free hand and went, "Quick, back up the passage," his buckled shoes loud on the stone. Clara set the candlesticks on the sill and unfolded the note one-handed. It was written in a lovely flowing hand on hot-pressed paper that smelled, faintly, of the same rose that came off the woman herself, and it was short. "I know what you keep beneath your Sunday shift. I know whose it was. Come to the yew-walk before the dressing bell, alone, and we shall see whether you are a clever girl or only a bold one. H." The paper trembled once in Clara's hand, and then went still, because she made it go still. She stood in the passage a long moment, with the heat pressing at the little window and the bees droning in the espaliered plum beyond it, and she understood that Thomas had been sent up to her room, and that her box had been opened, and that the last 4 years had come down to a strip of flannel that had kept the damp from a book and hidden nothing at all. She could have run. The thought came whole and tempting, out through the kitchen court and down the drive and onto the county road in the white noon, with her mother's ring and 2 false references and the clothes on her back, and let them make what tale of it they liked. A maid who runs is a maid who is guilty, but a maid who is gone cannot be tried. She stood on the edge of it, as she had stood on the edge of the terrace, and then she thought of Mrs. Doone answering the bells all day to keep her from that room, and of the Duke saying, "I do not break my word, and I find I do not want to," and she found she could not do it. Not yet. Not without knowing what Honoria knew. The yew walk lay along the north side of the great garden, where the sun never fully reached. A green tunnel clipped these 200 years, and even in the July blaze, it held a churchyard cool that raised the hair on Clara's arms. Lady Honoria was already there, her parasol furled now, for there was no sun to guard against, walking slowly down the shadowed alley, with her gloved hand trailing the wall of clipped yew as she went. "You came," she said without turning. "I confess I half thought you would bolt. It is what your sort generally does." She turned then, and her beauty in the green gloom was a cold and perfect thing. "But you are not quite my sort of your sort, are you, Clara Ainsley? Or whatever you are truly called. For I have had a look at your little book." "It is mine," Clara said. "My father's before me. You have had it stolen from my room." "I have had it borrowed." Honoria smiled. "And I have read what is written on the front of it, in a lady's hand, to a boy called Gabriel. And I have thought a great deal, this last half hour, about how a duchess's book, given by her own hand to her own son, comes to be sewn into the flannel of an upstairs maid who arrived in this house under a false name 4 years ago, with 2 references no one has ever troubled to write to." She let the yew branch spring back from her fingers. "Do you know what that is called, when it is said aloud in the right room? It is not called a good ear and a better wit. It is called theft. And the daughter of a thief, keeping the goods, and creeping into the very house they were taken from, why, that is a story a magistrate could hang a great deal upon." The cold of the yew walk had got into Clara's chest. "My father was no thief. Perhaps not. Perhaps he bought it honestly at some sale, from some rogue who was the thief, and never knew." Honoria tilted her lovely head, and her voice went soft and reasonable, and altogether terrible. "It scarcely signifies. A story does not require to be true, my dear. It requires only to be told first, and told well, and by someone the county will believe, and they will believe me long before they believe you." "Then tell it," Clara said. and was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Tell it and be done. Why have you brought me here? Because I am not a monster, whatever you may think me." Honoria began to draw on her gloves, finger by finger, the way a woman does who is preparing to leave. "I am a practical woman in an impractical situation. His Grace has taken a whim. Whims pass, but not while they are being fed, and you, standing in his library answering his riddles, are feeding this one very prettily. So here is my kindness, and I shall offer it only once. Go tonight. Take your book and your ring and whatever else is yours, and go quietly. Before Sir Hugh Marchmont, who knew that book when it lived in this house, and who will know it again within a minute of seeing it, before that old man is shown what your box contains. Go, and I will let the whole matter sink. No thief, no magistrate, no shame carried to your father's memory. You have my word. And if I stay?" "If you stay," said Honoria, drawing the last glove smooth, "then before this party ends, in front of the Dowager and Sir Hugh, and every soul who witnessed his Grace's foolish promise, I shall have that book laid upon the table, and I shall ask the one question you cannot answer without ruin, how it came into your keeping. And I shall watch the Duke's face while he learns that the clever maid he could not stop thinking of is a liar with stolen goods sewn into her shift." She stepped close, and the rose scent of her was all around Clara in the cold green air. "I do not wish to do it. It is untidy, and I dislike untidiness. But I will. Choose. Clara, you have until the dressing bell." She went, unhurried as she had come, her rose-red skirts whispering along the clipped green wall, and left Clara standing alone in the churchyard cool of the yew walk, with the choice sitting in her chest like a swallowed coal, to save herself by flight and let her father's book go back into silence, or to stay and be made, before the man who had looked at her as though she had walked out of a book, into a thief. She did not go to the yew walk's answer. The house gave her no time to. She was still standing among the yews, turning Honoria's kindness over and finding the knife inside it, when Bess came flying down the alley with her skirts in both hands and her face white as a scullery cloth. "Clara, Clara, you're wanted. The Dowager, the small parlour, and his Grace is there, and the old gentleman, and, oh, Clara, her ladyship's with them, and Mr. Hartley says you're to come this minute, and," Bess's voice dropped to a horrified whisper, "there's a book on the table. Green. I saw it through the door." So Honoria had not waited for the dressing bell after all. She had never meant to. The offer in the yew walk had been the cat's paw laid gently on the mouse, only to feel it run. The small parlour, that had been the coolest room in the house at noon, was crowded now and close, the half-drawn blinds letting in their gold-barred dimness, the dried rose and lavender scent of the old lady's own room overlaid with the dust and leather of travel, and something else, some faint male sharpness of snuff and horse and hot broadcloth. The Dowager sat in her straight chair by the empty grate, her fan closed, her small bright eyes on the door. Gabriel stood at the window with his coat on now. He had put his coat on, Clara saw, and understood the whole gravity of the hour from that one fact, and his face was a shut door. Lady Honoria sat a little apart with her hands folded and her parasol across her knees, the very picture of a lady reluctantly present at an unpleasantness. And by the table, polishing a pair of eyeglasses on a large silk handkerchief, stood a spare old gentleman with a long clever face and white hair worn a fashion out of date, whom Clara had never in her life set eyes on, and who looked up at her as she came in with a mild scholarly curiosity. That was, in that room of hard faces, almost the hardest thing to bear. On the table between them all lay the green book. "Come in, girl, and shut the door," the Dowager said. "We will not air this in the passage." The fan tapped once against her knuckles, that small dry crack. "You know why you are here." "I think I do, Your Grace." Clara stood where the servant stood, her hands folded, her eyes level with the old lady's folded hands, and every scrap of the stillness 4 years had taught her drawn about her like a cloak. That book was taken from my room without my leave. It was brought to me, said the dowager, by Lady Honoria, who was troubled in her conscience, as she says, for the honour of this house. Whether it was rightly come by is a smaller matter than what is written in it. Sir Hugh. She turned her head a fraction. You have looked at it. Tell them what you told me. The old gentleman set his eyeglasses upon his nose and lifted the book, and turned it in his spotted hands with a tenderness that had nothing to do with its worth in money, and everything to do with the 20 years, Clara thought, that stood between him and the last time he had held it. I should know this little book, Sir Hugh Marchmont said, in the dark, by the weight of it. His voice was dry and precise and unexpectedly kind. I gave it to her. To the Duchess, to Eleanor, for a birthday, when we were both very young, and I fancied myself a wit for finding a book of enigmas for the cleverest woman of my acquaintance. She wrote the child's name in it herself, the year the boy was breeched. He looked over his glasses at Gabriel, and something moved in the long old face. Your name, your grace. For my Gabriel, that he may always be cleverer than his father. She would not let me read the rest of what she wrote. She said it was between her and her son. The room was very still. Clara did not look at the Duke. She could not. And how, said the dowager, did it leave this house? That, madam, I never knew, and it has grieved me above 20 years. The old man laid the book down again, gently, upon the table. When we lost her, her books were to have been kept whole for the boy, every one, and this one above all. It was in the settlement of her things I had it from the man of business myself, and yet within the 12-month I heard it had been seen in a bookseller's tray in Winchester, priced at £1 among the sermons, and by the time I sent to buy it back, it was gone into a private hand, and no man could tell me whose. He took off his glasses and folded them. I have looked for it every year of my life since, and here it is, on your table, and here, he turned his mild, ruined gaze upon Clara, is the young woman who has kept it. So you will forgive an old man, my dear, if he asks you very plainly, and with no wish to do you harm, how did you come by Eleanor's book? And there it was, the one question Honoria had promised, laid before her not by malice at all, but by a grieving old man's love, which was somehow far worse, and Clara felt the last of the ground she stood on go soft beneath her, because she could not answer it with the truth, and could not answer it with a lie that would hold, and the silence stretched, and stretched, and in the stretching became itself an answer. She cannot say, Lady Honoria murmured, into that silence, gently, as though it pained her, Your Grace. She cannot say because there is no honest way it could have come to a schoolmaster's daughter who now blacks your grates. I am sorry. I take no pleasure in it. But you gave your word before us all, and I could not in conscience let you give your name, this family's name, to a girl who came into your house under a false one, keeping your own mother's stolen book beneath her bed. It was not stolen. Clara's voice broke out of her before she could weigh it, low and shaking. Not by my father. He was the gentlest man that ever lived. He never took a thing that was not his in all his days. She stopped, appalled at the heat of it, at how much of her true self had come up into her face. Then how? The dowager said, quiet and inexorable. You have only to tell us, child, if your father bought it honestly of the bookseller Sir Hugh names, then he is no thief, and there is an end. £1 out of Winchester in an open tray. It is the easiest thing in the world to say, if it is true. The fan opened with a snap. Why do you not say it? Because it was not the whole of it. Because the more Clara had turned it over these 3 days, the surer she had grown that she could not answer it here. For her father, a gentle scholar, who had done no wrong in the whole of his honest life, had come by the book in a way she knew well enough, but a way that, told cold in such a room, would sound to these people like nothing but theft, that to lay the plain truth bare she must first unravel the false name she had worn 4 years, and stand before them all as another man's daughter entirely, and that she would sooner stand here and be called a thief before the man she was beginning, God help her. 2. Before all of them, than drag her gentle father's memory into this guilt-barred room to be picked over by strangers. So she lifted her head, and she looked not at the dowager and not at Honoria, but at Gabriel, who had not spoken one word since she entered, whose face was the shut door still, and she said the only thing she could. I cannot tell you how it came to him, Your Grace. Not here, not in this room, before these witnesses, for it is not mine alone to say, and the saying of it can do no one any good. Her voice was very quiet, but it did not shake now. You may call that guilt if you choose. Her ladyship will. But I have taken nothing from this house, and I answered your riddle because I knew it, and for no other reason under heaven. And if my knowing it has ruined me, then I am ruined, and there is nothing more I can do to mend it than to go. She curtsied to the dowager, low, and turned for the door. Stop, said the Duke. It was the first word he had spoken, and it stopped her with her hand upon the latch. Gabriel came away from the window at last, into the gold-barred dimness of the little room, and stood between Clara and the door, as though he would put himself in the way of her leaving. He was not looking at his grandmother, nor at Sir Hugh, nor at Lady Honoria arranging her pained and lovely face. He was looking at Clara, and there was something working in him that she could not read. Not the light, delighted attention of the library, and not the shut door either, but something harder and more painful. A man made to choose between the plain fact before his eyes and the thing his own judgment kept insisting upon against all the evidence. You will forgive me, he said, and his voice was low and level and meant for her alone, though the whole room drank it in. If I find I am less interested in how a book crossed a county 20 years ago than in why a woman who has done nothing wrong will not lift one finger to save herself. He took a breath. You could clear yourself in a sentence. My grandmother has all but written it for you. And you will not say it. I have watched clever people lie all my life, Clara. I was bred among them. It is the native tongue of every drawing room in England, and I know the sound of it, and this is not that sound. He shook his head slowly. This is the sound of someone protecting somebody. Who are you protecting? Your Grace does himself no service, Honoria began, rising, impressing a servant's. Be quiet. He did not raise his voice, he did not so much as turn his head, but Lady Honoria sat down again, as though her strings had been cut, and a spot of colour came up hard along each perfect cheekbone. You have brought me a book and a great deal of conscience, madam, and I am obliged to you for the one, and I will trouble you no further for the other. Grandmother Sir Hugh, I must ask you to leave me a quarter of an hour with this woman. No, do not look so. I have not gone soft in the head with the heat, whatever the servants' hall may say. I gave my word before 40 people, and I will not hand my name to a stranger on a whim, nor withdraw it on a rumour. I will have the truth first. From her, alone, the dowager looked at her grandson for a long, weighing moment, and whatever she saw in his face made her rise, at last, with the heaviness of her years, and gather her fan and her shawl. A quarter of an hour, she said, and the door open, if you please. We are not yet so far gone in scandal as to close it. At the threshold she paused, and turned her small bright eyes on Clara, and there was in them something that was not kindness, and yet was no longer quite the magistrate either. For what it is worth, girl, and it may be worth nothing before this day is out, I have watched liars for 60 years, and my grandson has the right of it. You do not lie like a thief. You lie like a woman with something behind her, and I begin to think I should very much like to know what it is. She went, and Sir Hugh went after her, pausing only to lay one dry old hand for an instant against the green cover of the book upon the table, as a man touches a thing he has mourned and dares not yet believe he has found. And Lady Honoria went last of all, and at the door she looked back once, and the pained and lovely mask was gone, and what was underneath it was cold and bright and patient as a blade laid by for later. And Clara understood that whatever passed in this room, in the next quarter of an hour, that woman was not finished, and would never be finished, until one of them was gone from the house for good. Then the door stood open on the empty gold corridor, and the bees droned in the terrace roses beyond the half-drawn blind, and the small parlour held only Clara and the Duke and the little green book that had waited 20 years upon the table between them. "Now," Gabriel said. He did not move toward her. He kept the whole width of the worn carpet between them, and Clara understood that too, that he was giving her the room, the way one gives room to a creature that will bolt if crowded. "There is no one here but me. My grandmother is halfway to her own door and pretending not to listen, which she is, and Sir Hugh is too deaf to catch a word through a wall, and Lady Honoria has gone to sharpen whatever she means to use next. It is only us." His voice gentled, and it was the gentleness that nearly undid her, far more than the anger could have. "You said there was a thing you would not tell in that room, before witnesses, because it was not yours to say, and could do no good. Very well. There are no witnesses now. Tell me." "Your Grace, Gabriel." He said it quietly, and the single word fell into the still room like a stone into a well. "In this quarter hour, while the door is open, and my name is halfway pledged to you before God and the county, call me by my name. I find I have wanted to hear you say it since the library, and I have not the least notion why, and I am too tired and too far in to pretend otherwise." Clara stood with her back against the open door, and her hands pressed flat to the cool painted panel behind her, as a person steadies herself against something that will not hold still, and she looked at the young man across the worn carpet, at the disordered dark hair and the shut door of his face come open now, all the way open, onto something that frightened her more than the dowager's judgment or Honoria's blade, and she felt the last wall she had built in 4 years of silence begin, quietly and terribly, to give way. "If I tell you," she said, and her voice was barely more than the bees at the window, "you cannot unknow it. Neither of us can. Whatever your word before the county, whatever your grandmother decides, if I say the thing I guess at, it will stand in this room forever after, between us and behind us, and there will be no going back to this morning. When I was only the maid who answered your riddle." She drew one unsteady breath. "I have kept my father's book and my father's name and my own name locked in a deal box under the eaves for 4 years, and I have not once been asked, and I have been so grateful I could have wept for it. And now you are asking. And I find I would rather tell you than any soul living. That is the whole of my danger, Gabriel, not the book, not her ladyship, not the magistrate she threatens me with. You, that I want to tell you." And in the gold-barred hush, with the door standing open on the empty corridor, and the green book waiting on the table, and the whole house holding its breath around them, Clara Ainsley opened her mouth to say aloud, at last, the thing she had sworn to carry to the end of her days, and out in the corridor, sudden and near and shattering the stillness like glass, a woman's voice cried out, and there came the heavy sound of someone falling, and the little silver crash of a fan striking the marble floor. The fan struck the marble first, a small silver crash, and Clara was moving before the sound of it had finished, out through the open door into the gold-barred corridor, where the Dowager Duchess of Thornbury had gone down against the wainscot, with one hand still reaching for the wall that had not caught her. Grandmother, Gabriel, was a half-step behind, but Clara had already dropped to her knees on the hot marble, and it was Clara's hands that reached the old woman first. The dowager's face had gone the grey-white of tallow, her lips bloodless, her small bright eyes rolled half shut, and the shawl she had gathered so proudly at the door lay twisted at her throat like a noose the heat had drawn tight. Clara did not wait to be told. 4 years of carrying scuttles up airless stairs had taught her exactly what a July afternoon did to old blood and tight lacing, and she worked as she thought, quick and sure. Her stays, the shawl is choking her, it must come loose. Clara's fingers were already at the pins. Your Grace, lift her a little. No, not up, flat, and her feet higher than her head. Here, against my knee. She flung the shawl aside and dragged the pillow cushion from the corridor chair, thrust it under the old woman's slippered feet. Bess, run, Mrs. Doone in the still room. Tell her the dowager has swooned in the heat, the sal volatile and the hartshorn, and a basin of vinegar water, and open every blind on this floor as you go. Run! Girl, don't gape! Bess ran. Her feet went clattering down the corridor, and the sound of it seemed to break the spell that had held them all, because now Sir Hugh was there, and Honoria risen from her chair in the parlour doorway, with her hand pressed to her own lovely throat, and doing precisely nothing. Air, Clara said. She wants air, not a crowd about her. Stand back, if you please. And they stood back, an earl's daughter and a knight of 40 years standing, stepping back at the word of an upstairs maid, because the maid was the only person in the passage who knew what she was about. She chafed the thin, cold wrists between her palms, hard, the way one wakes a hand that has slept. She loosened the top hooks of the old woman's gown with fingers that did not fumble. When Mrs. Doone came panting up the last stair with the little green bottle, it was into Clara's hand she put it, and it was Clara who cracked it under the dowager's nose. Once, twice, so that the sharp reek of it cut through the lavender and the heat like a blade through silk. The dowager's eyes flew open. She drew a long, shuddering breath, coughed, and fixed her gaze, small, bright, outraged, entirely alive, upon the face bent close above her own. You, she said faintly, are holding my head in your lap on my own landing, girl, in front of the whole house. Yes, your grace. Clara did not let go. And I shall go on holding it until you can sit without the floor coming up to meet you. Drink this. She held the hartshorn and water to the old lips. Small sips. There. The dowager drank. Colour crept back into the grey cheeks, slow as dawn. And over the old woman's head Clara felt, rather than saw, Gabriel go down on one knee beside her on the marble, close enough that his shoulder pressed her own, and heard him say, low, not to his grandmother at all. You see. This is what I could not make them understand in that room. This is not a woman who does harm. The dowager rested a quarter of an hour on the daybed in the small parlour before she would consent to be spoken to. And Clara stayed the whole of it, kneeling by the couch with the vinegar cloth, changing it on the papery forehead each time it warmed. The room had emptied of its worst. Honoria had withdrawn to the window. Sir Hugh sat quiet by the cold grate, turning the green book in his hands, and Mrs. Doone stood by the door with her arms folded and her whole broad body arranged as a wall between Clara and whatever meant to come at her next. At length the dowager put out one dry hand and closed it, hard, over Clara's wrist. Now, she said, and her voice had got its edge back, I have been rescued, on my own landing, by the very creature this family spent the morning deciding whether to hand to a magistrate. The absurdity of it is not lost on me. I am 81 years old, and I have never once fainted before an audience, and I do not thank you for the novelty. Her fingers tightened. But I am not so proud as to be ungrateful, nor so foolish as to mistake what I have just seen. So you will finish what you began, before I so inconveniently interrupted it. My grandson asked you a question. Whom are you protecting? Answer it. Answer it to all of us. And have done. Clara knelt very still with the cooling cloth in her hand. She looked round the crowded little room, at Sir Hugh, who had mourned the book 20 years, at the dowager, grey yet and gripping her wrist, at Honoria, motionless at the window with the light behind her, and last at Gabriel, standing now against the shelf of the far wall, with his arms folded and his whole self bent toward her, waiting. And she found that the wall inside her, which had held 4 years against every ringing bell and sidelong look, had already come down on the landing, when she caught an old woman's head against her knee, that she had, without knowing it, chosen, and that all that remained was to say the words. My father, she said, was John Carrick. That was my name, before I took my mother's. Carrick. She watched Sir Hugh's head come up sharp off the book. You knew him. I think, sir, you have only to look at me a moment more, and you will place the name. Carrick. The old man breathed it. His long face changed, opened, 20 years falling out of it. The young tutor. Eleanor's tutor for the boy, the mild fellow with the Latin, the year before we. Good God. You are little Carrick's girl. I am. Clara's voice did not shake now. It had gone past shaking into a strange, still clearness, like water after the mud has settled. He came here at 24 to teach a small boy his letters, and he loved this house, and he loved the Duchess who was kind to a poor scholar when no one else troubled to be. He told me so, once, near the end, when he had grown careless of guarding it. She turned the cloth over in her hands, and when she was taken from you all, and the old Duke in his grief had her things cleared out of the house, sold, given, scattered. Because he could not bear the sight of them, my father saw her books go down to Winchester in a bookseller's cart with the sermons and the almanacs. He had no standing to prevent it. A dismissed tutor cannot countermand a duke. But he had a shilling. Sir Hugh made a low sound and pressed his handkerchief to his mouth. A shilling in an open tray, the dowager said slowly. You told him so yourself, Hugh, priced among the sermons. He bought it back, Clara said. The one book of all of them she had cared for above the rest, the little green book she had written her boy's name into with her own hand. He bought it for a shilling out of the tray, meaning to keep it safe until the young master was grown enough to be given it, and to understand it. That was the whole of his crime, Your Grace. He bought a book that was being thrown away, for the price it was thrown away at, and he never once tried to sell it or make a farthing of it, though we were poor as church mice to the end of his days. Then why? Gabriel said from the wall, and his voice was not quite steady. Did he never bring it to me? Clara looked at him then, full, and let him have the truth of it whole. Because he was ashamed. She said it gently, for it was a gentle grief. He was a dismissed servant, and you were a duke's son, and a poor man does not walk up to a great house and offer a boy his mother's inscribed book without every soul in the county reading it as theft. The very reading her ladyship put upon it in this room an hour ago. He was afraid of exactly what has come to pass. So he waited for the courage, and the years went by, and the courage never came, and instead he set me the riddles out of it at the kitchen table, because it was the only way he had left of keeping her kindness alive in the world. Her throat worked. He never told me whose book it was, only that it mattered more than all the rest, and I was to keep it whole. I found her writing in the front of it after he was gone. For my Gabriel, and I understood then where it belonged, and I understood I had not the courage either. The room was utterly silent. Even the bees at the window seemed to have hushed. And so, the dowager said, very low, you came here. I came here. Clara set the cloth down in the basin. Under my mother's name, with references a kind neighbor wrote me, that were true in every particular but the name at the top. I told myself I would find a way to give it back. I would learn the house, and watch for the hour, and one day I would put the Duchess's book into her son's hands, and be gone before anyone asked how I came by it. A breath went out of her, half a laugh, and wholly without mirth. 4 years I have carried it up and down that back stair, 3 floors above your head, waiting for a courage no braver than my father's ever was. And in the end I did not give it to you at all. You wrung it out of me with a riddle. She lifted her chin. So there is your answer, Your Grace. I was protecting a good and gentle man, who did one frightened thing in a life of honest ones. That is the whole of it. There is nothing behind me but love, and a shilling, and 20 years of a dead man's silence. Sir Hugh rose from his chair. He crossed the worn carpet with the green book held in both his old hands, and he did not go to the dowager, and he did not go to the Duke. He came to Clara, kneeling still by the couch, and he put the book down into her lap as gently as a man lays a sleeping thing in a cradle. Little Carrick's girl, he said, and his voice cracked clean across. He kept faith. All those years I thought some rogue had it for spite, and it was mild John Carrick keeping faith with a kindness, and teaching his daughter to be clever out of it. Exactly as Eleanor would have, he could not finish. He pressed the handkerchief to his eyes and turned away to the window, and no one in that room was ill-bred enough to look at him. It was Honoria who broke it. A very affecting tale, she said from the window, and the coolness of her voice fell into the warm room like a stone down a well. Beautifully told. One almost forgets there is not a shred of proof in the whole of it. A dead father who cannot be asked. A shilling no one saw paid. A name the girl claims only now that claiming it may save her neck. She came forward a step, lovely and composed, the mask perfectly back in place. Your Grace, I do not doubt she believes it. Servants do come to believe the stories they tell themselves, but you cannot pledge a duchy on a swooning fit and a pretty confession. She has produced a father from the air, and a purchase no living soul can swear to. It changes nothing that signifies. It changes a great deal, the Dowager said. It changes nothing a court would. There will be no court. The old woman drew herself up against the cushions, grey yet, but entirely herself, and her small eyes had gone hard as jet. Sit down, Lady Honoria. No, you will hear me, since you have been so free with your conscience all the day long. There will be no court, no magistrate, and no scandal. And I will tell you precisely why. Because the only theft that has occurred under this roof today was done at your bidding. The fan came up. You sent my footman into a servant's private room to take her box. Do not trouble to deny it. The boy Thomas has been to Mrs. Doone in a lather of guilt this hour past, and Mrs. Doone has been to me. You coerced a servant of this house, you threatened him with his place, and you rifled a girl's belongings for a weapon to break her with. That, madam, is what a magistrate would find interesting. Honoria had gone very white. I acted for the honor of your family. You acted for a coronet. The Dowager's voice did not rise, and was the more terrible for it. You wanted my grandson, and this girl stood in your light, and you have spent a summer's day trying to have her hanged for it. Do you know what that is called, when it is said aloud in the right room? The old woman let the words hang. Honoria's own turned back upon her. It is not called conscience. For one moment, one only, the mask slipped, and what showed beneath it was not malice, but something bleaner and more desolate. A beautiful woman of 29 who had been bred, exactly as the Duke's riddle had said of them all, to shine and to be chosen, and who had reached the end of her seasons with nothing to show for the shining but this. It was there, and gone. Then Honoria gathered her parasol, and her train, and the last rags of her composure. You will regret this, she said, to the room in general. I regret a great many things, said the Dowager. You will not be the chief of them. Hartley will have your carriage at the door within the hour. I trust you will make your farewells brief. And Lady Honoria, the fan snapped shut. You will say nothing, anywhere, ever, of what has passed in this house today. Because if one whisper of it reaches me, I shall tell the whole of London how the Earl of Carrow's daughter set a footman to burgle a housemaid's box, and I shall tell it beautifully, and they will believe me long before they believe you. She inclined her head a bare half-inch. Good afternoon. Honoria Vane went out of the small parlour, and out of the house, and out of the story, with her rose-red skirts whispering along the corridor exactly as they had whispered in. And if there was a stiffness now in the perfect back, only Clara marked it. And Clara, who knew what it was to walk out of a room with nothing but the clothes she stood in, found she could not, in the end, hate her. The Dowager slept after that, worn out with heat and outrage, and Sir Hugh went to write letters he had waited 20 years to write, and Mrs. Doone gathered Clara up off her knees with one strong arm and murmured against her cap, "There, my lamb, there. I told you the wind takes the tall trees first," and went away to have a good cry over the pastry, where no one would see her. And so it was, as the long light of the summer evening came slanting gold through the tall windows, that Clara and Gabriel were left alone once more in the room where the green book lay upon the table between them. Exactly as they had been an hour and a lifetime ago. He crossed to her this time. He did not keep the carpet's width. He came and stood close, and he took up the book from where Sir Hugh had laid it in her lap, and he turned to the title page, and he read his mother's words in his mother's hand for the first time since he had been a small boy solving a riddle for a sugared almond. "For my Gabriel," he read aloud, very low, "that he may always be cleverer than his father, and never tell him so." His hand was not quite steady on the page. I had forgotten she wrote it. I had forgotten her hand entire. "And you have carried it 3 floors above me for 4 years, meaning one day to be brave enough to give it back." "I never was brave enough," Clara said. "You must not make me better than I am." I hid it, and I hid myself, and I should have gone on hiding both to the end of my days if you had not set your ladies a shadow to catch. And you answered it. He set the book down, gently, and looked at her, the grey stuff of her gown, the reddened knuckles, the curl come loose again at her damp temple, the whole plain truth of her standing in the gold evening light with nothing left to guard. "Do you know what my mother told me the day I solved that riddle? She said the cleverest thing in the world is not the wit that finds the clever answer. It is the honesty that stoops to the true one, when the true one is under everyone's feet and beneath everyone's notice." His voice roughened. "You told me that yourself, in this very house, 3 days ago, and did not know you were quoting her. They will not stoop to it, you said, because it is beneath them. It is under their feet the whole while. Clara, you are the answer to more riddles than mine." She could not speak. The tears she had held back through the swoon and the confession, and the whole burning day rose now, and stood in her eyes, and would not be commanded. "I gave my word before 40 people, Gabriel said, that I would court whoever answered true. I have been told all day what a fool that word has made me. My grandmother thought it, at the first. Lady Honoria built her whole campaign on it, and I have stood here and discovered that it is the wisest thing I ever said in my life, because it has brought me you." He took her hand, the reddened, work-roughened, candle-scarred hand, and held it in both of his as though it were the rarest thing in the room, which to him it plainly was. "I will not court you cleverly. You have had a bellyful of clever people today. I will court you truly. Marry me, Clara Carrick. Not because of a riddle, nor a word given, nor a book brought home, because I have not had one honest hour in that whole gilded drawing-room to equal 1/4 in your quiet company, and I do not mean to spend the rest of my life without them." "You cannot," she whispered. "A duke and a housemaid, the county, may make of it what it likes. It generally does, and it is generally wrong." A gleam came into him, the dry, warm gleam she had surprised out of him on the terrace. "Besides, you are not a housemaid. You are a schoolmaster's daughter who reads Latin and answers riddles that defeat the flower of 3 counties. I am marrying up, and everyone shall know it. And that, absurdly, after the terror and the grief of the whole long day, was what broke her, not the grand words but the small dry joke, the one he had learned to make. The laugh came up through the tears, warm and startled and wholly her own, and she pressed her free hand to her mouth exactly as she had on the burning terrace, and this time she did not catch it back. "There," Gabriel said softly, watching her. "You can do that. I shall spend a great many years making certain you go on doing it." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the reddened knuckles. "Unhurried, sure. Say yes, Clara. You have kept everyone waiting quite long enough." "Yes," she said, into the gold and beeswax hush of the room where she had first dared to speak. "Yes, on one condition, Your Grace, for I have learnt this day to name my terms. The book is yours. It was always yours. But you shall let me keep setting the riddles. My father set them at his kitchen table, and his father before him, I dare say, and I mean our children to have them by the fire of an evening exactly as I did." She caught the word children, and did not blush at it. and I will not have a house where the cleverest thing in it is kept in a drawing room and never used." "Agreed," he said, and gladly. "On one condition of my own." His thumb moved slow across the back of her hand. "But the very first riddle you set under this roof as its mistress is that one. The shadow. So that I may hear you answer it again, and know, this time, that you are staying to see me solve you in return." The great house of Thornbury, which had spent a summer as the talk of 4 counties, for a duke who chose his bride with a riddle, spent the following spring as the talk of 5, for the same duke married the girl who had answered it, quietly, in the small grey church at the edge of the park, with the hawthorn breaking white along the lanes and the whole of below stairs weeping frank happy tears in the back pews, and Mrs. Doone in a new bonnet she pretended all morning she had not bought for the occasion. They did not go far. After, there was too much at home worth staying for. On a warm green evening, some months on, with the long windows of the library open to the scent of cut grass and the blackbird pouring out the last of the light, the Duke of Thornbury came in from the park in his shirt-sleeves to find his Duchess curled in the great chair by the window, with a small green book open in her lap and a smudge of ink upon her cheek, and his grandmother, restored entirely to health and to tyranny, installed opposite with her fan and her sharp, bright eyes, being read a riddle and pretending, with enormous dignity, that she had not the least idea of the answer. "You are both of you insufferable," the dowager announced, "and I cannot think how I bore this house before you came to plague it, girl," which was, from that quarter, as near to love as made no difference, and Clara had long since learned to hear it so. Gabriel came and stood behind the chair, and looked down over his wife's shoulder at the worn page his mother had once turned by a nursery fire, and rested his broad hand a moment on the ink-stained one that held it. Outside the window his own shadow lay stretched long across the warm gold floor beside hers. The two of them run together at last into a single shape upon the boards, faithful and quiet, and asking no wages, and keeping, now, no secrets at all. "Set me another," he said against her hair. "I find I never tire of not being cleverest in the room." And Clara Carrick, who had carried a book and a name and a whole silent self up and down a cold stair for 4 long years, turned the page in the warm light, and laughed, and did. If this one warmed you by the fire tonight, do stay a while, subscribe, and light a candle in the comments for John Carrick's Kept Faith, and I shall have another tale ready for you when the wick burns low. Until then, from all of us here at Adrian's Fireside, sleep gently and be kind.